Hello, this is Patricia Martin, and I'm your host today for Jungian Mythology. In this episode, we're talking about heroines, popular culture, and Carl Jung's theories on myth and the self. I'm so excited today to have Dr. Laura Vecchiolla, a clinical psychologist who works in private practice based in Chicago, and she's a former colleague of mine. We studied together at the Institute, and we're having her on today because she's an expert in women, myth, and the new generation of archetypes. She has written a thesis, her doctoral thesis on the hero's journey and trauma recovery, and has also published several chapter contributions that highlight how modern myths, such as Star Wars and Wonder Woman, can do the very same healing things for the next generation. Laura, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Patricia. I'm really happy to be here.
Oh, great. So, to start off with, I think it's always helpful to really just get a handle on Carl Jung's journey into mythology and get into the roots of that. And then I want to talk about Wonder Woman and female archetypes.
Yeah, sure.
So let's go to the root source, Carl Jung and mythology. What's your take on his, I think I can call it an obsession?
Yeah. I mean, he furiously wrote about everything. So
right,
I think that's a fair assessment. But I think he's not, he's certainly not the only analyst who is interested in myth, right? So I think that says something about myth itself, that there's this really powerful draw to understanding why myth is so enduring and impactful. Before Carl Jung, his mentor, and then maybe not so much mentor, Freud, studied myth as well. I think the most famous example being his use of the Oedipus myth, and how he used that myth in describing his theory of psychosexual development, right? So, I mean, for Freud, myth was it was just so limited. It was just, these are taboo fantasies, these are unconscious desires that we cannot allow our consciousness to be brought to light. And for Jung, it was really so much more than that. It was really so expansive. For Jung, I think myths really served as a function or a tool that allowed us contact with the unconscious, that allowed us contact with these archetypal forces in their symbolic form, and gave us ways to watch them interact, gave us ways to watch them dialogue. And I think for Jung, more so than maybe mythologists or anthropologists, he saw myths truly as reflections of what was happening internally within the psyche, rather than reflections of our external world. So they weren't snapshots of, what was going on chronologically in, ancient Rome at the time. And they weren't snapshots of what was going on within that culture between men and women. They were really, for Jung, a representation, a reflection of these archetypes and the way in which they represent themselves symbolically in our inner lives, in our inner world.
I think sometimes we can almost feel that. I remember the first time I read the Myth of Psyche, and as she's facing all of these trials, it took my breath away. Oh my gosh, she has to pick through thousands and thousands of seeds and sort them. And, but she's sent aid just just like the other heroes. Anyway, the point being that they are myths are still resonant, and I think that really kind of gets to the heart of what Jung was trying to explain about what makes something archetypal. When we're thinking about, this notion of something always being true, no matter what the generation is, it's what Jungians think of as archetypal. But I know that word gets tossed around a lot, and I'm not sure everybody is really clear or agrees. What do we mean when we say archetypal?
Right. So when we say archetypal, essentially these are pre-verbal forces or energies within the unconscious. Per Jung, they are containers of opposites, right? So they hold within the archetype itself, holds within it all its potentiality, right? So then in order for it to travel up, and even the word up is a bit random at this point, but just to give some semblance of direction, for it to travel up into our consciousness, we have to give it representation. We have to give it language or a symbol. And this is where an archetype becomes an archetypal image. So even as we're talking about the hero archetype, it's actually a bit of a misnomer, because what we're really talking about is the hero archetypal image.
Okay, so let's just spend a couple of seconds on that. What's the
Sure.
difference between an image and a story in this regard?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think an image in and of itself is a story, right? Because an image is a symbol, and a symbol carries meaning. I mean, I think if I were a literary nerd, I'd probably be giving a different answer. But I think in just looking at a symbol, right? So if I just presented you with a hero, right, with nothing but sort of the image in front of you, perhaps the type of, so the gender maybe, the weaponry, the body type, right? These are all images, constructs, derivatives of this archetype, images, right? And they're already sort of telling a story.
Oh, in other words, in one glance, you can sort of, the unconscious gets that.
Right. Right. So if you ask two different people, when I say which, we're kind of moving a bit away from here just for a second, like, what do you imagine? And someone imagines the Wicked Witch of the West, and someone imagines Glinda the Good Witch. Neither of them are wrong. They just have ascribed different archetypal images to this archetypal force.
That's great. I think that's a great sort of roundup of all the ways that we can think about archetypes. And then you have written about the Wonder Woman archetype. And I think, maybe I should contextualize this a little bit, because what is sort of rising to the top in the culture right now, in the collective, is this idea of like, where are the stories of, anima, female archetypes? We've invested a great deal. Western culture has invested a great deal in the stories of Odysseus and, the hero's journey. What about women? And talk to me about Wonder Woman.
Sure. Anytime.
I mean, she's so great, right?
Yeah.
I want her lasso.
Yes,
Much.
absolutely. I mean, I think Wonder Woman is such a, I hear that resonates with all types of folks, because she really does fit. I mean, of all of the comic book heroes, true to form comic book heroes, She's one of the very few, I would argue, there's a few that are truly mythic, right? And when I say mythic, they follow, Joseph Campbell's hero's journey to the T, and she does. And she also really fits kind of the sort of demigod stereotype, right? I mean, in her original canon, she doesn't have a father. She was formed out of clay by her mother. So this very mythic, sort of cosmic start to her life. And I think, I mentioned she follows the hero's journey in the same way that, Odysseus did, and Heracles and Jason and, Batman, right? But what I think is so uniquely different about Wonder Woman is that she does reflect qualities that are more traditionally feminine. So that her story arc is a little different. She's the hero. She's the, in Maria Tartar's book, there's this lovely anecdote in her introduction about Joseph Campbell's last year at Sarah Lawrence College and how he was approached by a graduate student who asked him, I read your book, Heroes with a Thousand Faces, and where are the women heroes? And he responded, well, women are all over the hero's journey. They are the hero's mother, and they are, the goddess, right? They hold all of this mystery and the unknown, and they are the hero's ultimate prize. At the end, you rescued, the hero rescues the woman, and what more could you want? And the graduate student responds, I want to be the hero.
And I want, and I want to see the hero.
Right.
So that I can say, well, if she can do it, I can do it.
Right.
Which is really the point of all this.
Absolutely. This yearning for representation. So I think even just in that sense, there's a huge appeal in Wonder Woman as a hero. But more than that, she does her heroing a little bit differently. I mean, she has, of course, the thing that makes her a hero. She's got her strength and her cunning and her intelligence, much like many of her male counterparts. But I think, even just reflected in her weapons, right? Her lasso of truth and her bracelets of submission or victory, depending on, they have a few names, but these are all really non-violent weapons.
Yes, I think this is an essential point. I think it's one of the points that Maria Tatar is trying to make, is that the female hero, the heroine, is absolutely full of the same valor and worthy of honor, but is promoting a different set of values that are less about war,
yes,
and more about the collective goodness.
Yeah.
And right.
I think that's a huge piece. And you'll see this, I mean, most overtly depicted in myths of antiquity, where the male hero's, true purpose in his hero's journey is his own glory or legacy. I mean, but even in like other hero's journey myths with men that are more like Messiah type arcs, like the Matrix or Dune, there's still this sense of I am the chosen one, right? And I think that heroes who have more feminine qualities, or women heroes, there's much more of a sense of this is my caretaking duty, I am doing this as a way to protect others, or to fight on behalf of others, or to instill a sense of justice, to right a wrong that was done onto another. Right. So sometimes you'll see a sort of thread of a revenge type story in some heroine story arcs, that they're seeking to right a wrong that was done to someone they loved. So it's really less about this sort of personal glory seeking.
Yes. And it's less about questing and obtaining, to me, as and I haven't read the entire canon, but I see the difference between the road of trials in the hero's journey that Joseph Campbell talks about, and the tasks that women are given to complete, if they are,
Sure.
And that's sort of the equivalent, or it rides parallel, but those are very different concepts.
I think something that is in line with that is, and this is both a societal reflection, and then perhaps something that has just been internalized, is that so often women heroes are underestimated by the public. So using Wonder Woman as an example, I mean, in her origin, she came to America from Themyscira, and her first job was I believe, an army nurse. And then she was a secretary, right? So these very traditional, passive, meek roles, sort of walking around the world, unassuming, and any random person on the street would not expect her to be Wonder Woman, right? And so this other sense of, obviously in the realm of comic book heroes and superheroes, there's this alter identity, right? That's a separate sort of piece. But I think in heroes, in general, it's your name is out there. You are sort of boasting your heroism across the lands. You want tales told of your strength far and wide.
Oh yes. When Odysseus comes home, right, and he walks in, and that arrow goes through what is it, 7 or 9 hammerheads, or it's like, daddy's
not
home.
Subtle.
Right. Daddy's home.
Right. Right. And I think for the woman hero, it's much more unassuming, and less in the spotlight. Maria Tartar talks about this as well, is that sometimes some of the heroing is done sort of behind the scenes, and that can actually be an asset that people don't necessarily expect someone who looks like that or acts like that. One of my favorite, from middle school, one of my favorite female heroes is Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Oh, you're a Buffy fan.
A Buffy fan. A high school student, right? Who would have expected? And she could use that when needed, right? She could put on just a high school student. No need, to feel.
It was like a veil of invisibility. It was so commonplace that she made herself invisible, right?
And I think, speaking of invisibility, who had an invisible jet? Can you imagine a man having an invisible weapon that made him invisible? Oh.
Well, Harry Potter, but
that's fair. Harry Potter, I think, has more feminine, hero qualities than not.
Right.
Which we can talk about, how it's not necessarily a gendered, a biological sex, I should say, it's really more about the qualities of the hero, the traditionally feminine or traditionally masculine type qualities that new heroes are taking on. And I think new heroes are taking on more traditionally what would be considered feminine qualities.
Well, using Harry Potter just as an example,
Yeah.
Hermione is
Great.
full
Yeah.
of courage and daring and seems to have less concern for her physical safety than you might see in a traditional girl
Sure.
role,
Sure.
right?
And she's very commanding.
Very commanding and
Mhm.
and is not afraid to be seen using her powers.
Right. Right.
So she doesn't fall into any of the social self-doubt that would maybe,
Yeah.
pull her back. So I think what we're seeing is that these qualities are starting to get swapped out across the genders. And I think it's
Yes.
alchemically really exciting.
Well, I think really what's happening is that media is catching up with psyche and archetype, because archetype is non-gendered, right? Archetype is androgynous, and really only when we assign it those symbols, and we assign it meaning, does it become gendered or, in this fixed state. And so we're in this really exciting place in time in our culture where things are shifting, and we can start, different people are given space to tell stories, and we can start telling stories that involve different facets of these archetypal energies, different symbol sets.
Yeah, I look always on the horizon
Mm.
to see what's next in this, because I think every time um, an archetypal chord has been struck with using a woman's story where she is cast in a traditional kind of hero's role, meaning she's following the hero's journey.
Sure, sure.
It I mean, if all things are being equal and it's well written or it's well produced, it's a blockbuster.
Yeah.
I think of Cheryl Strayed's book Wild,
Mm.
right? Where it's it's a very rare example of a woman who is an adventurer.
Yeah.
She's just taking the adventurer. She's not
Yeah.
sure what she's getting out of it.
Right.
And those stories are rare for both male and female.
Very much so. Yeah.
Right. And yet it sold millions around the world. It got turned into a movie because there was hunger in the culture to see that kind of archetype. And so it makes me wonder, like, what takes so long for Wonder Woman to come to the screen, for the
Right.
next story to be written? Do you have any opinions or thoughts about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think when it comes to the movie industry, there are a lot of things, there's a lot of issues of what will sell. But I think there's always a need for these stories somewhere, right? Like there's always,
Right now, I think it's very episodic. Like there's an episode here
yeah,
and an episode there. But I don't
yeah,
think when you add all that up, it's creating a cast of heroines who you could kind of say, oh, now this is a body of work, or this is,
right,
you know,
right,
or it seems to come up. There's a kind of temporal thing about it. So 20 years ago, Women Who
mm,
Run with the Wolves, mega
yes,
bestseller,
yes,
which was just kind of written by a Jungian analyst,
hmm,
um, Clara Pincola Estes, and she, really kind of talked about all of the lost fairy tales and
yeah,
heroine stories. And again, it strikes a nerve because there's such a dearth of it available. So
right, right.
I guess I'm kind of it. My question is, do you look forward, and do you think we can look forward to seeing this more consistently and less episodically?
I hope. However, I do think there's a piece to having these stories that we're talking about, like Wonder Woman and these hero's
Mhm.
journey-esque stories. They're so popular in the media because they serve to entertain, and
Ah,
they are archetypes really that even though they serve our process of individuation and they do help us grow, they don't necessarily feel all that bad while we're doing it, right? It's a really
It's very entertaining.
empowering. Yeah, and it I think that it can be um in my research it's really proven to be, for some folks, part of their post-traumatic growth,
Let's
right?
go there. I want to go there, Laura, because I think there's something very profound about these ideas that
Sure.
this mythic structure, that these archetypes have the power to heal people's trauma. I really talk to me a little bit more about that and how you use myth in your practice. Let's
Sure.
start with first the bigger idea of how these myths are healing for us.
Yeah. um so I think one of the biggest components of why therapy can be healing is just to simply be witnessed and to feel this relational connection with your therapist, right? So then when you add myth, and specifically the hero's journey myths, uh, in where there's this calling towards action and uh, this saga, and where there's this trial of slaying dragons and thinking that all is lost, and then defeating what you thought could not be defeated, meeting myths like that and connecting with those myths can feel as though you've been witnessed and can feel relational, because you're really entering a working relationship with the archetypes of these myths in therapy, or I mean, even not, right? You don't necessarily have to be in therapy to gain therapeutic benefit from working with these myths. I mean, I think it's a great idea, but you don't have to
No,
be.
no,
Um,
you know what? I really, I feel like I want to just interject here for
sure.
just the sake of like putting a face to this. I've been working on a book, and this book has been like, uh, I feel like Odysseus at
Mm,
every turn,
yeah.
just I could see the smoke coming from the chimneys of home, and then
Hmm.
the wind fills my sails and takes me off course. And
Absolutely.
I think
You're
I'm
like, oh,
just
just
about ready
ping
to be
ponging all
done.
over the place.
Exactly. And then there's an ogre at my
Yeah.
gates, and
Yeah.
I'm like, oh my god. But even
Yep.
being able to think about it in those terms
It's
help help me to see that this
it's
won't last
so
forever.
validating. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
I can do this. This won't last
Hmm.
forever. This
Hmm.
is what it looks like to do something really hard and meaningful. And I'm not going to quit,
Right.
until I reach the
Right.
shore, until my hand touches the shore. So
Right.
it's just an example of how, yeah, it can really
Yeah.
work in someone's
I
life.
as I was writing my dissertation, which was a Herculean feat in and of itself, my motto was, if Frodo can make it to Mordor, I can finish this dissertation. So yeah,
Right.
there is something inspiring. Um, and then I think too, I mean, that's the piece that I meant when we were talking about the entertainment piece. Yeah, there is power in these heroes that make it through. But there's also pieces of the journey that are devastating, that to work through in therapy for someone who's survived some traumatic event, um, can be just as painful to work through as in the myth as well. So um, there are aspects of the story that are a betrayal, um, aspects where a mentor or a loved one dies, right? In Star Wars, this should not be a spoiler for anyone, but Obi-Wan Kenobi dies, right? And that can be, people are going through their own healing journeys, and life keeps going, right? So um, they can use some of the pain that the hero experiences, even though that hero experiences triumph, to understand that triumph isn't a good time all the time, right? That there's a lot of pain and sacrifice and loss. And that generally, in most of these stories, when they're done well, the hero is not the same. And in fact, the hero is usually a little bit sad, and a little bit different at the end because of some of what they went through, in their
Yeah,
effort to get through. Yeah.
they can't unknow
Mm-hmm.
what the journey has taught them.
Right. Right. And that can be really affirming, that you can heal, but also, if you look at Frodo or Luke, they are not the same person they were at the start of their story. They are wiser, and they are compassionate and empathic, and they have changed, but there is also a tinge of sadness there. And I think that's a realistic expectation for anyone who is healing from trauma or loss.
Yes, that what goes hand in hand with enduring the road of trials is that we have to make a contribution to that journey from our souls,
Mm-hmm.
which changes us
Yeah.
forever. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, this has been fascinating, Laura.
Yeah.
I ask everyone this question. Your work in writing chapters of books and contributing articles on all of this material is exciting to me, because I think you're one of the fresh young thought leaders in Jungian theory. Tell us more about what you're working on now, and what's the future look like for Laura Vecchiolla?
Sure. I can tell you what I hope it looks like. um, I'm working in private practice, and currently I'm a member of an association called the Association of Death Education and Counseling. I work a lot with, as I've mentioned, folks who've been through traumatic events, but also folks who've experienced loss and bereavement and traumatic and sudden loss. So through that association, I'm getting ready this fall to take my exam for my certification in thanatology. So what I hope to do, right now I'm a bit of a student. That's kind of my singular focus at the moment. But what I hope to do after that, phase of my life is through, and hopefully I've experienced some success, is I'd like to really bring myth and storytelling into conversations about death and loss, and how we can use stories and archetypal images and dialogues and amplification of those archetypal energies to help become more friendly with death, which I think is something that as a culture, we're kind of a death denying culture, and a very privately grieving culture. But I think collectively, it's something that really I hope to make more part of an everyday conversation, to make more, just as easily as we can talk about healing from trauma, I'd like to have that conversation about becoming more open and comfortable with death and grief.
I can only imagine. Yeah, I can only imagine how useful mythology is in that, because death is never what we think it is. In myth, death is right. heroes rise from the dead.
Right.
It,
Sometimes myths sort of perpetuate death denial.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's a handy tool. I can see how you could use it in therapy. So is there anything you were hoping that I would ask you, Laura, that I didn't, or is there anything that you've had a second thought about that you'd like to go into?
I don't think so. I think we've covered everything. This was really wonderful.
It was, Laura, I really want to thank you for being on the podcast with us today. And you had so much to say. I hope to have you back.
Yes, I would love to.
Great. We're just scratching the surface of this whole area of Jung and myth and archetypes. And so thanks again for being on the show. And we look forward to having you back.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It was wonderful.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like more information about training programs, archives, this podcast, or to find a Jungian analyst near you, visit our website, jungchicago.org. Thank you to our 2021 donors who gave at the contributing member level or above: the Arlene M. Feiner Trust, Barbara Anand, Arlo and Rena Compan, Judith Cooper, Kevin Davis, George J. Didier, Mary Doherty, Carl and Patricia Greer, Ryan Mayer, Patricia Martin, Boris Matthews, Sue Rosenthal, Diane Sherwood, Debbie Stutzman, Lawrence Chad Tingley, Alexander Wayne and Lynn Kopp, Gerald Weiner, and Ellen Young. You can also become a supporter of this podcast by visiting our website, jungchicago.org. Thanks.